The year was 101 BC, and across the dusty plains of northern Italy, two civilizations stood poised for a collision that would echo through eternity. On one side, the disciplined legions of Rome, their bronze-tipped spears glinting in the summer sun. On the other, a massive horde of Germanic warriors, whose ancestors had roamed the frozen forests of the north for countless generations. What happened next would not merely decide the fate of armies, but would witness the complete erasure of an entire people from the pages of history. The battle that unfolded at Vercellae was not just another military engagement, it was the final act in a terrifying drama that had been building for over a decade, a conflict so brutal and decisive that it would demonstrate Rome's capacity for total annihilation. By the time the dust settled that July afternoon, an entire civilization would cease to exist, their culture obliterated, their warriors slaughtered, their women and children sold into slavery. This was genocide, on a scale that would make even hardened Roman generals pause in reflection. But to understand how Rome achieved such complete and devastating victory, we must journey back to where this nightmare began. We must travel to the cold, windswept peninsula of Jutland, where catastrophe first set these wheels of destruction in motion. The story begins in the mists of northern Europe, where the harsh winters of the early 1st century BC brought unprecedented suffering to the Germanic tribes living in what we now call Denmark. The Cimbri, a proud warrior people who had inhabited these lands for generations, faced a crisis that would force them to abandon everything they had ever known. Whether it was devastating floods that swallowed their settlements or bitter cold that made survival impossible, the exact nature of the catastrophe remains lost to history. What we know is that it was severe enough to drive an entire nation from their homeland. Picture the scene as hundreds of thousands of Cimbri gathered their meager possessions, loaded their wagons, and began the long march south. This was no mere migration, it was a desperate exodus of a people with nowhere else to go. They were soon joined by their neighbors and kinsmen, the Teutones, creating a massive moving city of warriors, families, and livestock that stretched for miles across the European landscape. Contemporary sources suggest this migration involved over 200,000 people, making it one of the largest population movements in ancient history. These were not the barbarian hordes of Roman propaganda, but complex societies with their own laws, customs, and traditions. The Cimbri possessed sophisticated metalworking skills, created intricate jewelry, and maintained oral traditions that stretched back centuries. They worshipped gods of war and nature, practiced elaborate funeral rites, and governed themselves through assemblies of warriors and elders. Their society was built around concepts of honor, courage, and loyalty to tribe and family that would have been familiar to any Roman aristocrat. Yet as this massive population pressed southward through Europe, they carried with them the seeds of their own destruction. They were entering a world where Rome's influence stretched across vast territories, where the Republic's appetite for conquest and control knew no bounds. The collision between these two civilizations was inevitable, and when it came, it would be catastrophic. The first blood was spilled in 113 BC, when the migrating tribes crossed the Danube River and entered territory claimed by Rome's Celtic allies. The Taurici, unable to resist the massive Germanic invasion, sent desperate pleas for help to their Roman protectors. Rome's response was swift but catastrophically mismanaged. Consul Gnaeus Papirius Carbo, commanding Roman legions, chose treachery over diplomacy. When Cimbri emissaries approached under a flag of truce, promising they would not attack Roman allies if given safe passage, Carbo agreed to their terms. He even provided guides to show them routes away from Roman territory. But this was a trap, a calculated betrayal that would set the tone for over a decade of brutal warfare. Carbo had secretly positioned his legions to ambush the migrating tribes once they had moved into vulnerable territory. The Cimbri discovered this deception before it could be fully executed, and their response was swift and merciless. Near the settlement of Noreia, they turned on their Roman ambushers with the fury of a people betrayed. The battle was a massacre. Roman discipline crumbled in the face of Germanic rage, and over 20,000 legionaries died in a single day. Carbo himself barely escaped with his life, fleeing south with the remnants of his shattered army. This first encounter revealed something terrifying about these northern warriors. They fought with a ferocity that shocked even veteran Roman soldiers accustomed to warfare across the Mediterranean. Germanic warriors would charge into battle with wild abandon, their war cries echoing across the battlefield as they swung massive swords and hurled javelins with deadly accuracy. They showed no fear of death, believing that dying gloriously in battle would guarantee them a place in the halls of their gods. But perhaps most disturbing to Roman sensibilities was what happened after their victory. Rather than pressing their advantage and marching directly on Rome itself, the Germanic tribes simply melted away into the European wilderness. They had no interest in conquering Roman territory or establishing permanent settlements in Italy. They were still searching for new lands to call home, somewhere they could rebuild the lives that catastrophe had stolen from them in the north. This restraint would prove to be both their greatest strength and their ultimate weakness. For while the Cimbri and Teutones wandered through Gaul, raiding and pillaging to survive, Rome was gathering its strength for the inevitable confrontation. The defeat at Noreia had been a humiliation that the Republic would not forget or forgive. The Germanic tribes spent years moving through modern-day France, their massive wagon trains leaving trails of destruction across the countryside. They were not conquerors in the Roman sense, but rather desperate refugees who took what they needed to survive. Celtic tribes that tried to resist them were crushed or forced to flee. Some, recognizing the futility of resistance, joined the migration, adding their numbers to the already massive horde. During this period, the character of the migration began to change. What had started as a desperate flight from natural disaster was evolving into something more dangerous. The young warriors who had grown to maturity during years of constant warfare knew nothing but violence and raiding. They had no memory of the peaceful farming communities their parents had left behind in Jutland. For them, war had become a way of life, and Rome represented the ultimate prize. Meanwhile, in Rome itself, the disaster at Noreia had exposed deeper problems within the Republic. The legions that Carbo had led to defeat were composed primarily of property-owning citizens who served as part of their civic duty. But Rome's conquests had made the rich richer, while the poor lost their lands, creating a class of landless citizens who were excluded from military service. This was weakening the army precisely when Rome needed it most. The crisis deepened when the Germanic tribes finally decided to test Roman resolve directly. In 109 BC, they crossed into Roman-controlled territory in southern Gaul, the province of Gallia Narbonensis. Once again, Rome attempted to negotiate, sending consul Marcus Junius Silanus to meet with tribal leaders. The Germanic demands were not unreasonable by the standards of the age. They wanted lands in the Rhone Valley where they could settle permanently, and in exchange, they offered to defend Roman borders against other barbarian incursions. For a people who had been wandering homeless for years, this represented their greatest hope for peace and stability. But Rome had no intention of accommodating these northern invaders. Silanus rejected their proposals outright, and the inevitable battle that followed was another Roman disaster. The consul's legions were routed, their eagles captured, their survivors scattered. The message was clear. Rome could not stop the Germanic advance through conventional military means. The situation grew even more desperate when a portion of the tribal confederation, the Tigurini, decided to remain in Roman territory and continue raiding. In 107 BC, they ambushed a newly formed Roman army near Burdigala, modern-day Bordeaux. The Roman commanders were killed in the opening moments of the battle, and nearly 10,000 legionaries died in the massacre that followed. These repeated defeats sent shockwaves through Roman society. The republic that had conquered the Mediterranean was being humiliated by barbarian tribes from the frozen north. Panic began to spread through Italy as reports reached Rome of Germanic warriors who seemed unstoppable in battle. Some spoke of giants among their ranks, warriors who stood head and shoulders above normal men, and wielded weapons that could cleave through Roman armor like parchment. The reality was both more mundane and more terrifying. The Germanic warriors were not supernatural beings, but they possessed advantages that Roman generals had not yet learned to counter. They were fighting for their very survival, which gave them a desperation that professional soldiers could rarely match. Their tactics, while seemingly chaotic, were perfectly adapted to break the disciplined formations that had made Rome master of the Mediterranean world. More importantly, they vastly outnumbered the forces Rome could field against them. While Roman armies typically numbered in the tens of thousands, the Germanic migration represented a moving nation of hundreds of thousands of people, of whom perhaps 60 to 80,000 were warriors of fighting age. When these numbers were concentrated in a single battle, they could overwhelm even the most disciplined Roman formations through sheer mass. By 105 BC, Rome faced its greatest crisis since Hannibal had crossed the Alps over a century earlier. The Senate authorized the formation of a massive army, 80,000 strong, to march north and end the Germanic threat once and for all. This was one of the largest forces Rome had ever assembled, representing a significant portion of the Republic's total military strength. But the army that marched north to face the Germanic tribes carried within it the same social tensions that were tearing Roman society apart. The command was divided between two generals who represented different classes and different visions of what Rome should become. This division would lead to one of the most catastrophic defeats in Roman military history, setting the stage for the final confrontation that would determine whether Rome or the Germanic tribes would control the future of Europe. The commanders chosen to lead this massive force embodied everything that was rotting at the heart of the Roman Republic. Gnaeus Mallius Maximus, a commoner who had clawed his way to power through merit and political cunning, found himself paired with Quintus Servilius Caepio, a patrician whose noble blood stretched back to the founding of Rome itself. From the moment they took joint command, these two men despised each other with a hatred that would prove more destructive than any Germanic weapon. Caepio viewed Maximus as an upstart, a nouveau riche pretender who had no right to command men whose families had served Rome for centuries. How dare this nobody, this new man with no aristocratic heritage, presume to give orders to someone whose ancestors had walked with Romulus himself? The very idea was an affront to the natural order, a violation of everything that made Rome great. Maximus, for his part, saw in Caepio everything that was wrong with the Republic's ruling class. Here was a man who had inherited his position rather than earning it, who believed that blood mattered more than ability, who would sacrifice Rome's interests to preserve his own dignity. These two worldviews were incompatible, and their collision would drench the fields of Gaul in Roman blood. When the army reached the Rhone River near Arausio in 105 BC, the dysfunction became immediately apparent. Maximus positioned his forces on the western bank as ordered, but Caepio refused to cross, keeping his legions on the eastern side in deliberate defiance of military protocol. Even when the Senate sent direct orders commanding him to unite the forces, Caepio complied only in the most technical sense, establishing a separate camp and refusing to coordinate with his co-commander. The Germanic tribes, led by their king Boiorix, recognized the opportunity that Roman pride had handed them. Rather than attacking immediately, they sent emissaries to negotiate with Maximus, requesting passage into Hispania, where they could finally find the new homeland they had been seeking for over a decade. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the crisis might be resolved without further bloodshed. But Caepio could not tolerate the possibility that a commoner might achieve the glory of ending the Germanic threat through diplomacy. In a decision that would haunt Rome for generations, he ordered his forces to attack the Germanic camp without warning or coordination with Maximus. His smaller force, acting alone, was quickly surrounded and systematically destroyed. Caepio himself fled the battlefield, abandoning his men to die while he preserved his own aristocratic skin. The slaughter of Caepio's legions was only the beginning. Boiorix, realizing that Roman treachery had made peace impossible, launched his full force against Maximus before the remaining Roman commander could prepare adequate defenses. The battle that followed was not a contest between armies, but a massacre of unprecedented proportions. 80,000 Roman legionaries died on that blood-soaked field, their bodies piled so high that the Rhone River ran red for days afterward. It was Rome's worst military disaster since Cannae, a defeat so complete and devastating that it shook the very foundations of the Republic. Entire legions simply ceased to exist, their eagles captured, their standards trampled into the mud by Germanic boots. The aftermath revealed the true horror of what had transpired. Among the dead were not just soldiers, but the flower of Roman society. Young nobles who had joined the campaign seeking glory found themselves butchered alongside common legionaries. Veterans who had served in a dozen campaigns died forgotten in foreign fields, their experience and loyalty counting for nothing against Germanic fury. Yet once again, the Germanic tribes failed to press their advantage. Rather than marching directly on Rome while the city lay defenseless, they turned west into Hispania, seeking the lands they had been denied through negotiation. This restraint, which Romans would later interpret as divine providence, gave the Republic one final chance to survive. In Rome itself, panic gripped the population as news of the disaster reached the city. Citizens barricaded their homes, expecting Germanic warriors to appear at the gates at any moment. The Senate declared a state of emergency, suspending normal governance as they struggled to comprehend the magnitude of the catastrophe. Some called for immediate peace negotiations, willing to surrender Roman territory rather than face complete annihilation. But there was one man who saw opportunity in disaster, who recognized that Rome's greatest crisis could become the foundation for its ultimate triumph. Gaius Marius, the victor of the Jugotham War, understood that the old ways of fighting had failed catastrophically. The citizen soldiers who had conquered the Mediterranean were no match for the desperate fury of homeless barbarians fighting for their very survival. Marius began implementing reforms that would revolutionize Roman warfare and create the most lethal military machine the ancient world had ever seen. He opened the legions to landless citizens, transforming the army from a part-time civic duty into a professional fighting force. These new soldiers would fight not for patriotic duty, but for the promise of land and plunder, creating a loyalty that transcended traditional Roman values. The training regimens Marius instituted were brutal beyond anything Rome had previously known. Legionaries learned to march 25 miles in full equipment, carrying everything they needed for extended campaigns. They drilled endlessly with their weapons until sword work became as natural as breathing. Most importantly, they learned to fight as a unified machine, each soldier's survival depending absolutely on the man standing beside him. The new legions were organized around the cohort, a flexible unit of 400 men that could operate independently or as part of a larger formation. This system allowed Roman commanders to respond quickly to changing battlefield conditions, adapting their tactics to counter the chaotic charges that had proven so effective against traditional Roman formations. But Marius understood that military reform alone would not be sufficient. The Germanic tribes had demonstrated that they could defeat any Roman army through superior numbers and desperate courage. To ensure victory, Rome would need to divide its enemies, forcing them to fight on multiple fronts, where Roman discipline and organization could prove decisive. Fortune smiled on this strategy when the Germanic Confederation finally decided to invade Italy in 102 BC. The tribal leadership, perhaps recognizing that their massive numbers were becoming a liability during the Long March, divided their forces into two separate armies. The Teutones, led by their king Teutobod, would advance along the Mediterranean coast, while the Cimbri, under Boiorix, would move through the Alpine passes into northern Italy. This division was exactly what Marius had been hoping for. Rather than facing the entire Germanic horde at once, Rome could engage each army separately, using interior lines of communication to shift forces as needed. The strategy would require perfect timing and flawless execution, but it offered the Republic its best chance for survival. The first test came in the summer of 102 BC, when the Teutones approached Marius's fortified camp near the Rhone River. The Germanic warriors, drunk on years of victory over Roman armies, expected another easy triumph. They had grown accustomed to seeing Roman formations break and run when faced with their wild charges and terrifying war cries. Instead, they encountered something entirely new. Marius's legionaries stood firm behind their fortifications, their faces grim with professional determination. These were not the part-time soldiers who had died at Arausio, but hardened veterans who had trained for months specifically to face this moment. When the Germanic assault came, it broke like waves against the Roman defences. For 3 days, the Teutones hurled themselves against Marius's fortifications, achieving nothing but their own slaughter. Thousands of Germanic warriors died in futile attacks, their bodies piling up before the Roman walls like cordwood. The psychological effect on both armies was profound. The Teutones began to doubt their own invincibility, while the Roman legionaries gained the confidence that had been shattered at Arausio. Recognizing the futility of direct assault, Teutobod decided to bypass the Roman position entirely, marching his army north in an attempt to find a more vulnerable route into Italy. But Marius had anticipated this move, shadowing the Germanic advance with his own forces until he could force a battle on ground of his choosing. The confrontation came at Aquae Sextiae, where Marius positioned his 40,000 legionaries on high ground overlooking the Germanic line of march. Hidden in nearby forests, 4,000 additional Romans waited in ambush, ready to strike at the crucial moment. Everything depended on timing and discipline, qualities that would determine whether Rome survived or perished. The trap was set with meticulous precision. Marius understood that this single moment would determine not just the fate of his army, but the survival of Rome itself. As the Teutonic horde approached the killing ground, their massive wagon trains stretching for miles behind them, the Roman general felt the weight of history pressing down upon his shoulders. Everything that Rome had built over centuries of conquest hung in the balance of what would unfold in the next few hours. The Germanic warriors moved with the confidence of men who had never known defeat against Roman arms. Their previous victories had convinced them that these southern soldiers were weak, that their discipline would crumble at the first sight of northern fury. They had no conception of what Marius had forged in the crucible of his reforms, no understanding that they were walking into the jaws of a machine designed specifically for their destruction. Teutobod himself rode at the head of his warriors, his massive frame adorned with the armor and weapons taken from fallen Roman commanders. Around his neck hung a torque of gold stripped from Caepio's corpse, while his sword had been pulled from the cold fingers of Silanus himself. To his followers, he seemed invincible, a giant among men who had humbled the masters of the Mediterranean world. But pride, as the Greeks had taught, comes before the fall. The battle began with Marius employing the oldest trick in the Roman tactical manual. His cavalry charged down the hillside in a ferocious assault, their war cries echoing across the valley as they crashed into the Germanic front lines. For a moment, it seemed as though the Romans were committing to a direct confrontation, matching fury with fury in the traditional manner. But this was theatre, not warfare. At the first sign of Germanic resistance, the Roman horsemen wheeled about and fled back up the slope, their retreat appearing panicked and disorganized. The Teutones, seeing what they believed was another Roman collapse, surged forward in pursuit, their disciplined ranks dissolving into a chaotic mass of individual warriors racing to claim glory and plunder. This was exactly what Marius had planned. As the Germanic warriors charged uphill, their formation fragmenting with each step, they ran directly into the teeth of Roman preparation. The first thing that met them was a wall of pila, the heavy javelins that Roman legionaries hurled with devastating accuracy. Thousands of iron points descended like deadly rain, punching through Germanic shields and armor, dropping warriors by the hundreds. Those who survived the javelin storm found themselves facing something unprecedented in their experience. The Roman shield wall that awaited them was not the loose formation they had broken so easily before, but a seamless barrier of overlapping scuta held by men who had trained for months to fight as a single organism. Behind those shields, gladi waited like the fangs of some monstrous serpent, ready to strike at any Germanic warrior who came within reach. The collision was tremendous, the sound of shield against shield echoing across the battlefield like thunder. But where previous Roman formations had bent and broken under Germanic pressure, Marius's legionaries stood firm. They had been conditioned to endure exactly this moment, to absorb the initial shock and then begin the methodical work of killing that would define the battle's outcome. The Teutonic charge, which had carried all before it for over a decade, spent itself against Roman discipline like a wave breaking against stone. Individual Germanic warriors found themselves isolated among enemies, their wild swings blocked by Roman shields, while short swords found the gaps in their defenses. The slaughter was systematic and merciless, each dead barbarian making the next kill easier for the legionaries who stepped over his corpse. But the true genius of Marius's plan had yet to reveal itself. As the main Germanic force became locked in desperate combat with the Roman front lines, the 4,000 legionaries hidden in the forest struck like a thunderbolt against the enemy's rear. The Teutones, already exhausted from their uphill charge and locked in melee with the main Roman force, found themselves trapped between two walls of steel. The psychological impact was immediate and catastrophic. Germanic warriors who had moments before been drunk on the prospect of victory suddenly realized they were surrounded, cut off from retreat, facing annihilation. The war cries that had terrified Roman armies for years turned to screams of panic and despair as the trap closed around them. Teutobod himself fell in those opening moments of the ambush, struck down by a Roman pilum that punched through his stolen armor and pinned him to the ground. His death sent shockwaves through the Germanic ranks, as warriors who had followed him across half of Europe watched their invincible leader die like any common soldier. Without his leadership, what remained of Teutonic resistance began to crumble. The battle became a massacre of unprecedented proportions. 50,000 Germanic warriors died on that hillside, their bodies covering the ground so thickly that Roman soldiers could walk from one end of the battlefield to the other without touching earth. The efficiency of the killing was terrifying to witness, each Roman formation working with mechanical precision to process the destruction of an entire people. Those Teutones who managed to break through the encirclement found no salvation in flight. Roman cavalry, freed from their diversionary role, pursued the fleeing barbarians across the countryside, cutting down exhausted warriors who had thrown away their weapons in desperate attempts to escape. The slaughter continued for days as Roman patrols hunted down survivors hiding in forests and caves. The aftermath revealed the true horror of what had transpired. The Germanic camp, filled with women, children, and elderly non-combatants, became the scene of systematic brutalization. Roman soldiers, their blood up from battle, showed no mercy to the families of their enemies. Thousands were killed outright, while tens of thousands more were herded together like cattle to be sold in the slave markets of Rome. Among the captives were the wives and daughters of Germanic chieftains, women who had once enjoyed positions of honor and influence in their tribal society. Now they found themselves chained and branded, their futures measured in the coin they would bring at auction. Children who had known freedom in the northern forests were marked for lives of servitude in Roman households, their own languages and customs to be beaten out of them by their new masters. But even as Rome celebrated the destruction of the Teutones, a greater threat remained. The Cimbri, The original architects of this great migration were still intact and marching toward Italy. Their army, perhaps 60,000 strong, represented the largest and most dangerous force the Germanic Confederation could field. Unlike the Teutones, who had been worn down by years of campaigning, the Cimbri had spent the winter resting and preparing for their final assault on Roman territory. King Boiorix had learned from the fate of his allies. Reports of the massacre at Aquae Sextiae had reached him through fleeing survivors, and he understood that Rome had found new ways to wage war. The old tactics that had served the Germanic tribes so well would need to be adapted if the Cimbri were to succeed where the Teutones had failed so catastrophically. Meanwhile, Marius faced his own challenges. His stunning victory had made him a hero throughout Rome, but it had also exposed the weaknesses in Roman defensive arrangements. While he had been destroying the Teutones in Gaul, his co-consul Quintus Lutatius Catulus had been tasked with defending the Alpine passes against Cimbric invasion. Catulus, commanding forces trained in the old manner, proved wholly inadequate to the task. The Cimbri, advancing through the Brenner Pass, swept aside his initial defensive positions with contemptuous ease. His second attempt to create a defensive line along the Adige River fared no better, as Germanic warriors outflanked his positions and forced him into headlong retreat. By the time Catulus reached the relative safety of the Po River, the Cimbri had already begun the systematic looting of northern Italy. Rich cities that had known peace for generations found themselves at the mercy of barbarian raiders who showed no understanding of Roman concepts of civilized warfare. The wealthy countryside between the Alps and the Po was stripped bare, its population either killed or enslaved. The success of this invasion sent shockwaves through Roman society. Despite Marius's victory over the Teutones, enemy warriors were now ravaging Italian soil, something that had not happened since Hannibal's campaign over a century earlier. Panic began to spread through the peninsula as refugees streamed south with tales of Germanic atrocities. But the Cimbri, exhausted from their long march and laden with plunder, made a crucial mistake. Rather than pressing their advantage and marching directly on Rome, they settled into winter quarters to rest and consolidate their gains. This decision, which seemed prudent from a military standpoint, gave Marius the time he needed to march his victorious legions back to Italy. The Roman people, terrified by reports of Germanic savagery, elected Marius consul for the 5th time, an unprecedented honor that reflected both their desperation and their confidence in his ability to save them. His army, blooded by victory and hardened by months of campaigning, represented Rome's last hope for survival. As winter gave way to spring in 101 BC, both sides prepared for what everyone understood would be the final confrontation. The Cimbri, reinforced by surviving remnants of other Germanic tribes, could field perhaps 80,000 warriors. Marius, his forces swollen by additional recruits drawn to serve under Rome's greatest general, commanded over 50,000 legionaries. The stage was set for a battle that would determine not just the fate of Rome, but the future of European civilization. In the balance hung everything that Rome had built, everything it represented, everything it hoped to become. The Cimbri, for their part, were fighting for something even more fundamental: the right to exist as a people, to find somewhere in this hostile world where they could rebuild the lives that catastrophe had stolen from them in the frozen north. Neither side could afford to lose, which meant that one of them would have to die. As July blazed across the plains of Vercellae, two civilizations approached their final reckoning. The air itself seemed to crackle with tension as Roman scouts brought word that the Cimbri had abandoned their winter camps and were moving southeast toward the Po Valley. Boiorix had made his choice. There would be no more delays, no more strategic retreats. His people would either find their new homeland in Italy or they would die trying. The Germanic king understood the mathematics of survival better than any Roman senator. His warriors numbered in the tens of thousands, but behind them stretched a wagon train containing every soul his people possessed. women heavy with child, elders who remembered the green fields of Jutland before the catastrophe, children who had known nothing but the endless march across Europe. They had no homeland to retreat to, no fortress walls to shelter behind. Victory or extinction were the only options remaining. Marius, now joined by the remnants of Catullus's battered legions, commanded the largest Roman army assembled in generations. His forces had grown to over 50,000 men, a mixture of his own battle-hardened veterans and fresh recruits eager to serve under Rome's greatest general. Yet as he watched the dust clouds marking the Cimbri advance, the Roman commander felt the familiar weight of absolute responsibility settling on his shoulders. The irony was not lost on him. These Germanic tribes had originally sought nothing more than safe passage and fertile lands where they could rebuild their shattered lives. Roman arrogance and treachery had transformed desperate refugees into Rome's most dangerous enemies. Now, after over a decade of warfare that had claimed hundreds of thousands of lives, the conflict would end where it should have ended from the beginning, in total annihilation. At Vercellae, beneath the scorching Italian sun, the final act played out with terrible swiftness. Marius's reformed legions, their shields locked in perfect formation, met the desperate charge of the Cimbri with mechanical precision. The Germanic warriors, fighting not just for victory, but for the very survival of their people, hurled themselves against Roman steel with the fury of the damned. But discipline conquered courage, organization triumphed over desperation. By evening, the entire Cimbri nation lay dead upon the field. Men, women, children, all sacrificed on the altar of Roman ambition. The refugee crisis that had begun in the frozen wastes of Jutland ended in the complete erasure of a civilization. Rome had not merely won a battle, it had perfected the art of genocide, demonstrating that when the Republic chose to destroy rather than conquer, it could erase entire peoples from existence with terrifying efficiency.